Oh, that did it automatically. That's great.
It's so hot down here, but y'all look so cool. I feel like I need to go get a scarf just to fit in. It's gonna be like 96 here today.
Wow.
Looks like all of our attendees are starting to filter in.
Yep. Hi, folks. Welcome on. We're waiting until we get a handful more folks to show up, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and get going. Thanks for joining us today for our first free webinar within a webinar series that the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center will be providing over the hopefully over the next 12 months. My name is Byron Komanek. I'm the executive director of our nonprofit organization, the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center, based at Jack Solar Garden in Longmont, Colorado. Today, we'll be talking about high-value agrivoltaic crops for Colorado. We have Professor Greg Barron-Gafford, Catherine Hunziker, and Professor Mark Kuchansky joining us today to talk about their different experiences in growing various types of crops underneath solar panels, as well as thinking about the markets for them. I also like to share a little bit about our nonprofit, Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. We have a very small team, as you can see pictured here, just 4 of us that are a part of this, with 3 main pillars that we work on. We work to provide educational opportunities to high school students. We have a dedicated high schools teacher, Allison Jackson, that works with us to bring out high school students over the course of the year. I think we've already had about 400 high school students come out this year alone. We do private tours and events for folks out at Jack Solar Garden throughout the season so that we can get our community more engaged in agrivoltaics, learn about solar to begin with and the potential of improving land stewardship underneath solar panels. Finally, we try to inspire policymakers to think differently about how solar can be installed, that we can do it in different ways to help improve the opportunities of livelihoods underneath solar panels through agriculture or conservation means. Just to share a little bit about the different things that we have offering right now. We have a creative writing contest for high school students in Colorado. So if you have a high schooler in your family that would be interested in learning more about agrivoltaics, it is a competitive contest where I think there is some prize money. You have to go to our website to learn a little bit more. We have high school tours on a regular basis. So if you know a high school teacher that would like to bring out their students, please contact us. We have a solar developer agrivoltaic workshop June 22nd to 23rd. If you're a solar developer or EPC interested in learning more about agrivoltaics, you can sign up for that workshop. And as I mentioned, we have public tours on a regular basis every Saturday morning throughout the growing season. Folks can sign up online to come out to Jack Solar Garden to see for yourself what we have going on. Finally, on our website, we have a variety of educational videos. Some of the videos are down below that you can take a look at. Scroll through those, take a look. So they're pretty short, so you can have a chance to learn a little bit more about agrivoltaics. And all of this is important because there are legislators out there that are making changes right now. This is a picture of Governor Jared Polis having signed a bill putting $500,000 towards agrivoltaic grants in Colorado. This just happened this past week, which is amazing that our state is a leader in agrivoltaics and we have legislators that are keen on this. So it's important for everybody to learn more about agrivoltaics so that our policymakers can be better educated as to how they should put forward laws in the future that impact us all. So we would be happy to have you all work together with us in spreading the word about agrivoltaics through these webinars and through on-site activities at Jack Solar Garden. And if you enjoy what we're doing here, please reach out and support us. You can go to our website, help donate, support what we got going on. I'm trying to learn how to be a better pitch maker for donors. So this is my attempt today, friends. Join all these wonderful sponsors already and support our work. All right, now on to the main event. We are going to start off with Dr. Greg Barron-Gafford of the University of Arizona, who I met back in 2018. That helped kickstart the idea for me for agrivoltaics here at Jack Solar Garden. Greg, I'm glad you were able to put on a scarf and join the team there. Greg, I'm not going to give much of an introduction to you, so feel free to jump on and start sharing for yourself. Thanks.
There we go. Thanks, Byron. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here today to talk about some of the work we've been doing up at Jack's Solar Garden. I've got a bunch of different names on here. I'm the guy here in blue, Greg Barron-Gafford, but all of this work is conducted by a larger team. Agrivoltaics is an inherently interdisciplinary field and requires a bunch of different perspectives to get this entire system captured and understood and monitored. But it also is a lot of work. And all of the names here in red represent some of our staff members and graduate students. The orange names here are undergraduate researchers who have come up and helped us do some of this work. And then the other dark names are some of our research staff. And this work really is a collaboration between Jack's Solar Garden, the folks who have brought us here today, who've really moved the needle in Colorado and nationally, internationally. Sprout City Farms, who leads the actual on-the-ground farm activities that enable this research to happen. And the Irrigation Innovation Consortium, which helped us do an aspect of this study that I'll bring up a little bit later. And naturally, the National Renewable Energy Lab, who's involved in all things agrivoltaics. And since I'm the first talker today, and because I come from a plant perspective, I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction there because you'll see that each one of the speakers today has a different motivation and a different perspective towards this. But having grown up in the West, in the Southwest, and being in Arizona and relying on water from Colorado, this is something that's constantly in our mind. Climate change is pushing our water resources towards a tipping point. To grow the food at Jack's, Byron has to petition for water. The amount of water that's made available to farmers is decreasing across our states. And the projections under these climate change scenarios, we always hear about, the drought. There's also these warmer temperatures. And this top graph is the projection of agricultural yields declining under different projected temperature change scenarios. So depending on how much hotter it gets, it's indicating how much we should expect our food supply to be dwindling. The bottom one is equally, if not more important. We're not talking about the mortality of the fruits and vegetables here. We're talking about the mortality of the farm workers. And you can see, and you can imagine, all of us spending more time outside in the summer growing season as it gets hotter and drier, just how vulnerable we are, especially the people who are bringing our food to us. And so this is also something we're imagining agrivoltaics can help with. So again, because you're going to be hearing about plants, and from the enrollment list, we're not all plant biologists, want to stress a little bit of a refresher on photosynthesis. So what's going on here? We remember that word photosynthesis. Plants need carbon dioxide to take up to do their photosynthetic work. But the other part of this story is actually really important for agrivoltaics. So plants have pores just like us, and every time they open their little pores to let carbon dioxide in, water escapes. And plants are under this constant battle to manage the fact that they need carbon dioxide in, but they don't want to lose their water. And so you can look at these two scenarios here, the left being a traditional full sun growing environment versus the right being agrivoltaics. And, let's pretend that we do have enough water resources that we can irrigate. We have irrigation going to each of these lettuce plants in this example. And this is the morning as represented by the sun coming in from the east. These plants are doing that transpiration. They're losing water because they're doing photosynthesis. So losing water is actually a good indicator that they're functioning well. They can afford to lose that water. But there's this other pool of water, right? There's the water that's in the soil. For all that energy and effort that we put into irrigation, we want to keep that moisture in the soil. In a full sun setting, it evaporates off to the atmosphere. That's why these dashed lines are represented as larger than here in the agrivoltaic setting. And that's simply because of the shade that's induced in agrivoltaics. But throughout the day, in that full sun, the soil moisture is depleted more quickly as opposed to the agrivoltaics. And remember, you have to have water in the soil to do that transpiration. So you can see now that our transpiration arrows are lower in that full sun setting. That means that the plants are able to do less photosynthesis because remember, they've got these pores and the plant doesn't want to lose all of its water. So it'll actually close its pores, shut those down when it runs out of water. What's the problem with that? Well, if it's closed its pores, no carbon dioxide can get in, which means you're no longer doing photosynthesis. And so this is the background driver for why agrivoltaics is working really well, especially in the Western US. So we wanted to understand, because we've had some success down here in Arizona, what does that pattern look like up at an agrivoltaic, an intentionally agrivoltaic system that has these tracking panels that are moving throughout the day? We know agrivoltaics are impacting that microclimate, the conditions under the panel, but how does that change how the plants respond? What is it like for them? Well, let's take a look at what the plants see. And I want you to pay attention to a few things in this one-day movie. You're going to see the sunlight come up. Look how dynamic the plants are. They actually are coming up to capture that light. Then they flare out to capture the light coming from the morning. You'll start to see the panels tracking throughout the day. And you'll start to see as the sunlight comes towards us and these farther bays, that is, I'm going to pause it real quick, the sunlight hitting the the sunlight hitting the plants that are getting mostly afternoon sunlight. And look how droopy their leaves are. They're running out of water, even in this agrivoltaic system, so they start to shut down. But then they get a little bit of shade from the solar panels and it gives them another chance for life. And you'll see the leaves come back up as they recharge and get ready to do more work. And then they go to sleep at night. So what does that look like in terms of actual photosynthesis? Well, first, we really have to think about that light environment. And because of a Jack solar garden is set up the way that it is, with about 15 feet of spacing between the two panels, we actually can put in 3 beds. In this figure, we're describing them as beds A, B, and C. And if the sun is coming from over on the right side of your screen, in the morning, bed A, or this westernmost bed, is getting lots of sunlight. This is sunlight for the time of day. And you can see it comes up, but then the solar panels actually start to capture that sunlight. And then the plants in bed A are in the shade the rest of the day, except for this little bloop here at dinner time. Bed B is the center or the middle bed, and it's not getting any of that morning or afternoon sunlight very much, but it's getting primarily midday sun, as opposed to bed C, which is in the easternmost side. And at this point, you can pretend that the sun is over on the left-hand side of your screen. It's shining in, getting blocked by solar panels, except in the afternoon when it captures only the afternoon sunlight. At Jack's, we also have plots directly underneath the solar panels. And as you can imagine, because they're right underneath the solar panel, they're not getting very much light in the middle of the day. So if we take that and make a cartoon out of it, this is what it would look like. In the morning, when the temperatures are relatively mild, the western bed is the one getting the direct sunlight because the panels are blocking that direct light to the other places. In the middle of the day, when it's warming up, you can see all beds are getting some direct sunlight. And in the afternoon, when it's the hottest, only that easternmost bed is actually still getting direct sunlight. Hope that makes sense. The challenge is that plants are influenced by not only sunlight and temperature. So it actually matters when you get your sunlight. So now that we know we are impacting the microclimate, and that changes throughout the day in terms of when you get your light versus what the temperature is, the question really became, how does that influence how plants function? And what does that mean in terms of the crop yield at the end? And so, back up here, part of what we're trying to do by capturing how these plants are functioning, as opposed to just understanding what the yield is at the end of the season, is that so many folks want to do agrivoltaics. We constantly get questions about what crops should I grow? Thankfully, Jack's Solar Garden is one of the biggest in the United States, and so we can grow multiple varieties of multiple different crop types. But unless you want to wait to the end of the growing season, so every year have to wait to find out what that data is, we're trying to figure out if there's a way that we can get a better insight into how these plants are doing. And so we actually went out and measured their photosynthesis. This is our little machine. It looks kind of like a Ghostbuster contraption where it has a box that runs off to this little chamber. You clamp it on the leaf. That leaf then can experience, the significant or a consistent level of carbon dioxide, light, and temperature that matches those outside conditions. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and they take your pulse to see how you're doing. If we take your pulse throughout a day, you get a sense of what stresses you out, when are you really ramped up, and when are you calmed down. We're doing a similar thing in terms of measuring the photosynthetic rate of plants. And in these graphs, the orange lines are the ones in the full sun. And so we're looking at photosynthesis across time of day in that west bed. Remember, the one that's getting morning sunlight, the center bed, which is getting midday sun, and the east bed, which is getting afternoon sunlight. And in all of these graphs, the open is the control, open to the full sun. And so it's the same across these because we have a control setting at Byron's Jack's Solar Garden site. So you can see when the sun comes out, the plants take off. They're doing lots of photosynthesis. And this particular plant, basil, they're doing pretty happily throughout the entire day. What about an agrivoltaic setting? Well, that western bed gets that morning sunlight, so the plants take off. It's still getting some sunlight in the middle of the day, but as it gets in the shade in the afternoon, its photosynthesis really drops off. The center bed, similarly, is doing really well most of the day. And the east bed here in blue, remember that little blip of sunlight that came through? Then it's in the shade most of the day, and then it's getting that afternoon sunlight. And so it does photosynthesis again. All of our products are being grown under, as you can see here, 100% irrigation and also 50% irrigation. This 50% irrigation is to see how much can agrivoltaics allow us to cut back on water. And because of that shade that's induced and all of this slowing down of evaporation, can we maintain photosynthesis, which is the driver for plants to be able to grow and reproduce. And this experiment around cutting back irrigation by half was sponsored by the Irrigation Innovation Consortium and a grant that was funded to the National Renewable Energy Lab and us working here at Jack's. So you're thinking, yeah, I see some interesting patterns. Some are higher, some are lower, but what does that actually mean? If you sum that up over the entire day, you get a measure of that cumulative carbon uptake. Why are we talking about carbon so much? Well, for one, we need to scrub that carbon out of the atmosphere, stored in plants and soils. But more than anything, carbon is what plants, that's their food. That's what they need to make their bigger structures and the fruits that we enjoy. So here's the orange control. We can see that according to our data measurements in basil, you get a little bit of a reduction, especially in the west and the east bed, where center is really pretty well. So the center bed seems to be the best place for basil, which got you about a 20% reduction in the carbon uptake. So yeah, basil took a hit in growing in an agrivoltaic setting. But when we cut back that irrigation, is now shown by these gray bars, you can see that yes, it reduced photosynthesis in the control. It actually did a little bit better by not being so wet in the agrivoltaic setting. And so that reduction actually goes down. So what this tells me that is under projected climate and water resource scenarios, agrivoltaics becomes more beneficial for basil. And I like to mention this point because we're not talking about just solving a problem in 2023. We're trying to also think about solutions that we might need as we get into our future scenarios. I'm not going to walk through all of the temporal kind of measurements we made every hour, but I will acknowledge that they do take a lot of work. Here's another one of our graduate students out there tediously measuring tomatoes, because this is a crop that we grow a lot of. And again, we did this under 100% and 50% irrigation, so we can make this plot of cumulative, intake of resources by the tomato. And in this case, we can see the center and east beds seem to be the best place to grow tomatoes. And I say seem to be intentionally. If we cut back on irrigation, again, it impacts everybody, but still the center bed is a really great place to make tomatoes. And why am I mentioning west versus center versus east? We're growing the same crops in all three of these beds because we're trying to understand where these plants do their best and where are they most beneficial, where are they having the most negative impact. So that if you were constructing a farm that was, say, for community supported agriculture, and you were able to have a mix of vegetable types, you could intentionally plant some crops in certain spaces, knowing the resulting light and temperature and moisture environment. Adding an overstory of PV panels had a minimum impact on overall tomato production, especially in that center bed where you can now produce energy and have the same level of yield. But taken together, how did this impact yield? Well, it varies by crop type and watering conditions. I've just shown you only data on basil and tomatoes, but let's look at it in a little bit different kind of way. Now we're looking at the difference in the yield. That's that end of season production, not carbon uptake, end of season production from basil. And anything positive would be increased because of agrivoltaics. Anything lower would be negative because of agrivoltaics. And you can see that we're having on average about a 25% reduction under that 100% irrigation regime. So if you don't stop watering the same amount and use agrivoltaics, you'll actually produce less. But look at the flip side. If you use agrivoltaics, you can actually use less water and make between 10 and 30% more basil per acre. That's a huge take-home message. Similarly with tomatoes, even though we talked about these reduced photosynthetic rates, we actually saw consistently greater production under agrivoltaics, especially in that west bed. Wait, hold on. I was talking about the east bed being better earlier. Well, we have to keep doing these works. I'm just going to skip through this for time. But the point here is that more photosynthesis at a daily measure doesn't always equal more crop yield. Remember, in this case, I was talking about the west bed seemed to be the worst place, and the center was the best place for producing tomatoes. But that didn't actually turn out to be the case in terms of yield, because it's not just about how much carbon was able to take up, but it's about the wet and dry cycles that created cracks in fruit or other impacts that negatively impacted the actual fruit production. The downside of this measurement is that we really do need to keep doing these field trials to determine which crops are best, because the numerical models that some of our other scientist friends use take photosynthetic data and try to anticipate yield. But our argument here is that as much as we try to understand the mechanisms behind what's going on, we still do have to wait for that yield data to come out. I only talked about tomatoes and basil today because of time, but I want to give you some other insights. From the Jack's Solar Garden, we also produced boulder beets, which for the most part took about a 20% hit in terms of production level. It varies by, again, spacing and irrigation level. But on average, I would say you should not expect agrivoltaics to help boulder beets, a crop that already is growing in appreciating cooler environments. But look about potatoes. Potatoes are consistently doing better, depending on where you put them, anywhere between 5 and 30% better. And this last one, I wish I could be more excited about. I personally cannot stand celery, but holy cow, if you like celery, you should 100% plant it in agrivoltaics, because we saw between 300 and 400% increase in yield. So hallelujah for all you celery lovers. And I'll end just by saying thank you to Byron for letting me get on your tractor. Thank you for opening the doors at Jack's Solar Garden, for allowing us to do this research on crop productivity in Colorado, to Sprout City Farms for being good farmers and putting up with all of our requirements to meet the challenges that we're trying to address through funding with NSF, National Renewable Energy Lab, and the Innovation Irrigation Innovation Consortium. So with that, I will pass it on to Mark, I believe. Is that right, Byron?
That's right. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. I didn't know you took that picture with that tractor either.
I know.
Also, folks, I did not mention, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be able to get to them over time. And then after all three presenters have gone, we'll have a question and answer time from you all to our presenters, and then even between our presenters. All right, I think I hit it. Mark, you're up, friend. Oh, and I should say, Mark, my parents met Mark before I did. So back in 2018, my folks went up to Fort Collins to learn about agrivoltaics, since we'd been hearing a little bit about it. And Mark helped inspire my parents, who own the farm where Jack Solar Garden is, that helped me down the pathway of setting up Jack Solar Garden. So thanks for teaching my folks, Mark.
I'm glad our field day worked and disseminated information out, and it resulted in a real project happening. So thanks so much, Greg, for your presentation. Thanks to the hosts for putting this event together. And thanks for having me today. My name is Mark Uchansky, and I'm a horticulturist by training, but I've learned enough about photovoltaics or solar to be dangerous. And so I've been learning over the past about 5 years now about these integrated systems called agrivoltaics as a new land use model. And as a horticulturist, I work with horticultural food crops, and specifically vegetables. And so, of course, as we set up some research to kind of address the questions that a lot of folks have around this space, we set up our research projects, and we started with vegetables, diversified vegetables. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture at Colorado State University. And this is a picture from our research farm, which will be kind of the focus of today's talk, just north of Fort Collins. So as Greg alluded to, and it's very true, there's a whole team of people that get this type of work done. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge who those folks are, and specifically Thomas Hickey, who is just now finishing up his master's degree in agrivoltaics. So there's a picture of him with his Sandbox Solar shirt on, enjoying the shade of some of those research plots under his photovoltaics array. He's a graduate student in our department, and one of my collaborators and colleagues, Dr. Jen Busolo, and I co-advised Tom on his project, which was very large and diverse, and I'm just going to focus on one aspect of that today that I think this group will find the most interesting. So I have a couple of logos there. This is Sandbox Solar, who kind of first introduced the idea to me. And my first reaction was kind of crazy, but let's give it a try. And here we are about 5 or 6 years later. Has worked for Sandbox Solar before. He's now an intern with NREL down in Golden, Colorado. And he's even started a agrivoltaics modeling business called Spades. That's that third logo there. So again, it's a team, and this group is lucky to get to see an unveiling of a brand new CSU, so Colorado State University agrivoltaics logo, which we just are unveiling today. A few terms that I'll kind of throw out there, and I think you might hear from our other speakers, and so I want to just go over a few of those briefly. But if I say photovoltaics, what I mean is what the general public usually calls solar, and that's solar photovoltaics generating electricity from sunlight. Can be abbreviated as PV. And to build a module, which we usually call a panel in the general public, to build one of those panels, they're made up of these individual photovoltaic cells. Those little cells are put together and aggregated into modules. Again, we would probably call that a panel. And then those modules can be put together into an array. So you'll hear me say those terms a couple of times. And then I can tell this is Tom's slide because I'm starting to get nervous talking about watts and kilowatt hours and all that good stuff. So I'll stop there, and I'll mostly focus on the horticulture, but you'll hear me talking about these terms because they're all integrated now. Of course, this is a very important topic because we all eat, and that food comes from somewhere. And of course, that's specifically our farms. And so I won't read off the statistics here, but I think we're all increasingly becoming aware of this touch point or nexus of energy, food, and water, and how we use water for energy production. We use water for food production, of course. And one big point that I want you to take away from this slide is that I only recently really fully made the realization that almost our entire food system is fossil fuel based, from initial tillage practices to fixing nitrogen to apply to our crops, to our cold supply chain, to shipping, to harvesting in many cases. Our tractors, our pumps are almost all run from fossil fuel based. And so that represents a very large opportunity to convert from fossil fuels over to cleaner energy sources, more carbon neutral energy sources, and electrify potentially the farm and the food system. You know that by 2040, the Colorado grid will be powered by 100% renewable sources, including solar. We have wind in Colorado, we have solar in Colorado, not so much on the hydroelectric, but a little bit, but not nearly as much as places like the Pacific Northwest. Then by 2050, the entire US grid is anticipated to be decarbonized. And so the question that comes up is, how will we get there? The way this was approached, I was approached with this subject around 2017, was one of our local solar installers came to me and said, Mark, basically we're out of rooftop space. We don't have enough room to meet our renewable energy goals in the state. We've maxed out. We don't have any other place to go, with a few exceptions, but basically we don't have anywhere near enough rooftop space to develop out the amount of physical space to put solar panels to deploy them. Or there are problems with some of those spaces. They're located in lakes or contaminated areas, disturbed areas, and even then that they may not be enough. So for that reason and lots of other reasons that I'm not going to get into today, agriculture is probably the most likely place where producers will choose, they will volunteer in many cases to place photovoltaics on their farm. Here's the combination of those two terms, the farming, the agriculture, and the photovoltaics or PV, and that's agrivoltaics as the combined term. I like this graphic a lot because it shows the scale from commodity crops and kind of a European type style system on the left there to pollinator habitat, grazing livestock like sheep and beef cattle. Specialty crops, which is what I'm going to focus on today, and you'll see examples of, to greenhouses and even to urban settings on the far right. Very briefly, I will allude to Dr. Jen Busalow's work with those systems, those more urban systems. Zooming in, here's a snapshot of agrivoltaics in Colorado. Byron already introduced, and Greg introduced the site in Longmont, Colorado, Jack Solar Garden. There's an aerial shot there. There's a second of our CSU agrivoltaics research logos that we're unveiling today with the combination of water, livestock, pollinators, and forage species there. And Byron showed some pictures of this same event, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it is a very exciting time to be in the agrivoltaic space because of momentum, interest, energy, and then importantly, funds available to do this kind of work. Zooming into kind of the Fort Collins area, we have two research locations for investigating agrivoltaic systems. The first one is called ARDEX South for horticultural research. And that's the one I will show you more details on as I go throughout the presentation. The other is at a foothills location, also in Fort Collins, and is a ground mount that's meant to simulate the rooftop of a building in an urban setting. This is Dr. Jen Busalow, my colleague, and her research site. I won't go into any detail here, but just to give you a visualization, of what these kind of research arrays look like and the crops growing underneath them. As I mentioned, our focus today in the place where I do a lot of my outdoor field work is called Ardex South, just north of Fort Collins. And it's an open field agrivoltaics test site. I'm pretty proud of it because it was established in 2018. And it includes panels of different transparency types, which I believe is unique, at least to this site and maybe one or two others across the US. But redirect focus a little bit more here. We're going to focus on that open field agrivoltaics in the past 3 years of research data. So here's a picture of after a rainstorm of that research array at Ardex South, and then a picture on the right there of the crops growing underneath it. Here's one more picture just to give you an idea of this replicated site. So this was installed specifically for the purpose of agrivoltaics testing and integrated into an existing agricultural field at CSU. And so here are a few of our funders and supporters to help us kind of lay that out there. And this is probably our best picture just to show you in one of these reps what the panels types are. So one of them is a traditional photovoltaics set of modules on this array. And so this one right here is the traditional set of panels that you would probably have on your rooftop. The one to the right is a semi-transparent type of panel. I'll tell you more details on this in a second. This is our open field plot with no pole mount or concrete or anything as our control. And then this is a bifacial type of panel, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Here's a zoomed in picture. And don't worry too much about the long names at the top. I'll mostly refer to these as their transparency type or level, and whether or not they can generate electricity in more than one direction. So on the far left-hand side is the panel that you would typically see on top of someone's roof or your home. They're opaque, so 0% transparency, and it's kind of your standard panel. It only generates electricity in one direction, light hitting that top surface. The middle panel is what we're calling bifacial, and it's about 5% transparent because of these openings in the glass between the cells. And it allows, again, about 5% of the light to come in. And importantly, it generates electricity from light on the top surface. And then any light that bounces around and hits the back surface also generates electricity. And that means that it produces about 1.25x amount of electricity and income, really, of the panel on the far left. And then finally, these are unique, and you can see they're a little different shape and size, but these are the cadmium telluride semi-transparent modules. They're kind of like a very light pair of sunglasses. And these are a new technology that we're interested in evaluating. Interestingly, I'm sitting in Telluride, Colorado right now. So I'll call these CAD telluride, or semi-transparent. And those are about 40% transparent. This is actually a grid connected array. So it's really generating electricity, and we wanted to really farm under it. So here's a picture of how we tilted the array to completely vertical to get a tractor nearby for tillage, to lay plastic, to lay drip lines. And then this other picture on the right here shows some of the transparent CAD-TEL panels at more of a vertical setting, and then the 30 degrees that would be typical, 30 degrees south. And these are kind of an array that does not move. It doesn't track with the sun like at Jack's Solar Garden. Tom is a very industrious person and student, and so he has shown exactly what the site would look like at different times of year and where the shadow would be cast from this array in mid-June, early and late in the year, and then in the middle of the winter, depending on the where the sun is in the sky. So this is a couple of very interesting graphics to show that. He has tracked the amount of irradiance at different times of year and how much shadow is cast by the different panel types in June, September, and then December. And from a electricity generation standpoint, that's watts per meter squared. And then this is showing that similar type of data, but with the 0% transparency opaque panels, and look how deep the shadow is, versus those 40% transparency panels. And that's where we were hoping we might see the best crop growth. So you probably are interested in data, so I'll get into that with a few final slides here. This is some pictures of our summer squash harvest and tomato harvest. Not dissimilar from Jack's. This is the way the array is set up most of the time, and with 3 beds. So this orange bed, the green bed down the center, and this purple bed or blue bed. The green bed in the middle is directly under the panels, and that was our summer squash. This one, again, not dissimilar from Jack. Some of the data shown at Jack's, our control yielded the highest, and in this case, it was significantly higher than each of the different panel types. But you'll notice that this one in green, the CALC, that semi-transparent one, was kind of borderline and was creeping up numerically, at least, getting fairly close to the control. But we did see over 2 years a little bit of a yield penalty with squash, summer squash, grown directly below the panels. We grew several other crops, peppers, lettuce, and tomatoes. So those are in the orange beds, which is where we'll start, the kind of south bed. Here, we did not see a yield decrease. In other words, the full sun open control yielded statistically slight numerical differences, but statistically was not, we didn't see any yield penalty under any of the panel types. Also numerically, we did see a little bit higher numerical value for the CAD-TEL. And you'll hear that theme continue to come up, that 40% transparent cadmium telluride panel seems like it's showing a lot of promise. Here's our jalapeno harvest, similar, where we did not see a yield penalty. So that's good news from a grower perspective. And thanks for the time warning, Byron. Similar story with the lettuce. So again, this is good news. We are growing a crop under or around the solar panels and producing electricity at the same time that we're producing a crop and not seeing a significant yield decrease. Here's one type of tomato that we grew called Red Racer. And if there are questions about this, it's a smaller, very fast, early maturing tomato. Same thing, we did not see a yield decrease. And if you look at the CAD-TEL there, again, numerically, just a little bit higher. We did have to shift our cultivars a little bit to grow tomatoes successfully. And then this was a Tasmanian chocolate. I love that cultivar name for this type of tomato. Again, same thing, no yield penalty with the different panel types. This is my second to last slide, and then I'll wrap up. This was a picture from late 2020, but not that late, September 10th, I think. My slide's a little bit cut off for me. For many of us, 2020 was a really hard year, between wildfire smoke, of course, COVID, and then an early snowstorm like this. But one thing that you'll notice, hopefully from the slide here, is that the summer squash that's growing under those panels was protected by and large, and we were able to harvest it off for a longer period of time after the snow kind of melted and shed off the edge of those panels. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and discussion at the end, but that's where I'll wrap up for now with a sunset slide. And thanks again for the time.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Fun to see what you had going on up there since I haven't been back for a little while. Mark will be around available to answer questions here after Catherine. If you have other Q&A questions you want to throw in the Q&A there, Mark might be able to have time to type in some answers too. Catherine, can you put on your video and get ready? Catherine Hunzinker is the founder of Wish Garden Herbs, and we met a handful of years ago. What was that? Maybe 2019, 2020, where I was trying to get to Wish Garden Herbs to be a subscriber to Jack's Solar Garden. And it didn't work out, but Catherine was super excited about coming out to the farm and being interested in growing herbs underneath our solar panels. So with Catherine over the past 2.5 years, we've been cultivating a variety of different medicinal herbs underneath our solar panels, from clary sage to motherwort, lemon balm, peppermint, Oh, sweetgrass, rosemary, oregano, boneset. Now we've put in some plantago, a variety of different things. Catherine, are you there?
Yes, but the host has disabled my video. I'm not able. Yeah.
I will work on that. Are you able to still present?
Well, shall I share my screen right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. We can see your screen and I'll work on getting your face up online, but go ahead.
Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Catherine Hunziker, and as Byron said, I am really excited to be working with agrivoltaics at Jack's Solar Garden. Let's see, I need to move a couple things out of the way here. And I come from a different point of view than the rest of you, and thank you all for your work. It is so important. I have an herbal company. We're national. I bought it. It was a closet in a hallway in 1987 and have been growing it organically ever since. I'm an herbalist. Turns out I had a talent for formulating. And I was also an old hippie and wanted to be part of a sustainable future. And a big part of what, I accidentally said that. Okay, we'll move on. And so getting into herbs was part of doing that. Let's call that sustainable health. One of the expressions I'll often use for that is paleo health or paleo medicine, helping our culture rediscover what herbs can bring to the table in terms of health. And we specialize in what is traditionally called tinctures. It's liquid extracts of medicinal herbs. And the beauty of that, teas are great, but you also get the non-water soluble constituents when you go into tinctures. And we are, I'll show you some of the things that are in various stores and online. We do both e-com and also brick and mortar. We are national, as I mentioned before. We have recently, according to Spins, become #1 in our category, which is herbal combinations in liquid tincture forms. And we also have been tagged as the fastest growing liquid tincture company over time. That it pays off, persistence. And part of what we offer is we have scaled artisan herbalism, effective formulas. If you're seeing this picture, you can see Fode and Emily in our QC QA department. We're supervised by the FDA. And we do a lot of testing, and actually a lot of our rules that we have to follow are coming from the pharmaceutical world. They don't exactly fit, but it's, we innovate and we work with that in order to meet some of the highest standards there are. We also really care about the quality of the herbs coming in beyond microbials, beyond some of the things that the FDA cares about. We care about vibrancy. Is it fresh? Is the efficacy? Are the constituent panels what we're looking for from a functionality point of view? So hopefully that gives you a bit of a window into where we're coming from, what we're doing. Our tinctures have innovated and moved forward, become something of a category leader in making them taste better. Tinctures, or I think there were only certain teas that tasted worse. Oops, went a little too far there. And my whole goal as an old activist is to bring this to the mainstream. How do we move forward with sustainable health? How do we help everything? Well, I'm just going to say that again, move forward. How do we create a sustainable future for what is it that the indigenous people call 7 generations, for our children and our children's children? And so part of that is bringing it to mainstream so more and more people can discover what botanicals, what medicinal botanicals have to offer. And just in case, one thing with the CBD and the hemp that's come along in the last few years, the upside is that has brought more awareness of medicinal plants forward. But the downside of that is not the only plant that has so much to offer. There are so many. And that's a big piece of what we're going to talk about here. Where can that go? What can that do? Let's see what's next. You should be seeing some of our most widely offered liquid extracts, tonics, and particularly with COVID, public awareness became much stronger about immune support, and supplement shopping kind of went off the charts to begin with. Our Kick-Ass Immune is probably the best known one, and it definitely took immune support to a whole new level, very active, sort of like putting up your shield, and also helping people get better faster and go after the bugs and what have you. Our Deep Lung, which I originally formulated for a local naturopath, actually helped people stay out of the hospital when they were starting to feel that tight breathing thing that came along with COVID. And I could go on and on about this, but I just wanted to give you kind of a peek into where we're coming from. One of the things that we brought to the channel that was a game changer is people do not know that herbs can be just as fast and effective as over-the-counters. 5 minutes, full symptom relief, and more body-friendly in general. Because they're paleo. Our bodies recognize it. We evolved with this as our medicine 99.9% of the time as human beings on this planet. Pharmaceuticals are relatively new to the table. They have a lot to offer. We need them. There's also what I would call phytopharmaceuticals, where you pull constituents out of the plants and concentrate them. So they're natural, but they're concentrated. It starts to be more of a pharmaceutical approach in that regard, but they are natural. An obvious one would be essential oils, but there's a lot of others that fit into that too. But what is least understood and known is whole plants. Taking the plant, is its areoles, is its roots, what's in there, what is the array of constituents that our bodies want to use for different things. And one of the things, going back to what I started with here, is fastest effect. We have to be careful about what we talk about. We have to operate under DSHEA, which is what claims we can make and how, if we're selling to the consumer on the other side. And so fastest effect is maybe another word for symptom soother. There's a plant from the Southwest, Yerba Santa, herb of the saints, saintly herb. It grows in northern Arizona, in Bay Area, north of the Bay Area in California. Nettles, you might have heard of that before. Echinacea, that is a very well-known immune herb that has come forward along with elderberry during the pandemic. Yerba Santa is probably one of the best antihistamines you can find. It's non-sedative, it's non-stimulating, 5 minutes, full symptom relief. If you know how to take it, you have to take it properly. But I just wanted to call this out about, wow, I didn't know herbs could do that. 5 minutes, full symptom relief. You know, a lot of people think, yeah, I know that they're medicinal, but tend to think of them as second level, you know, not as strong. And definitely more and more people recognizing that they have a lot to offer and can be alternatives to over the counter, I guess would be a way to talk about it. Okay, so hopefully that is kind of an introduction to where we're coming from. And I want to move on from there. Also notice these 3 herbs that are there. How many of those can we grow? Where are all these herbs coming from? The national market has been growing 10% or more per year over the last 20, 30 years. It's now $1 billion market and more in the US and continuing to grow. Where are these plants coming from? Still, the vast majority are coming from overseas, which is fine. We want to support that. Elderberry, which I just mentioned, the volume that's going into the supplements industry, which is huge, is mostly coming from Eastern Europe, but it grows here just fine. Let's bring medicinals home. Let's bring medicinals as viable domestic crops that can be grown in many parts of the US, all the way from some of the most extreme climates like Arizona up to New England, down to Florida, just all over. And it has a lot to bring. And one of the things that I saw when I first went to Jack's Solar Garden to see the agrivoltaics, I think it is very appropriate for agrivoltaics under those solar panels. And I'll speak to that more a little bit here, but what's different about this? What about these kinds of crops, and I mean serious crops, that have been sort of missing, that people tend not to see? They are very scalable. You can grow a lot and make good money. I did, before I put this slideshow together, I looked through sort of the wholesale pricing per pound, what you would pay a grower to go into the channel to be bought by either a consolidator, a herb broker, or direct to a supplements company. And they actually average around $20 a pound wholesale for the dried herbs. Little simplistic, but wanted you to give a window into it. The vast majority, yes, there's annuals, but most of them are perennials, either short-lived perennials or long-lived perennials, and they're all different sizes, from herbaceous, culinary type to witty little things like lavender or rosemary, to vines, to small shrubs, to large shrubs, to medium-sized trees, to full-size trees. And so you start to bring in not only perennialization and vastly improved soil health, regenerative soil, because you're not tilling and killing the life in the soil every season and starting over with that. They will sequester carbon. They will bring it in and regenerate the soil. Can be great plants for that. And also potentially can be revenue producing crops for agrivoltaics and regular farmers and all sorts of growers, to help them stay on their property, to help make it work. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'll kind of finish up this pitch, so to speak. Let's bring some medicinals forward. They can have so many answers here. Like even my company, Wish Garden, which is relatively small compared to another company here in Colorado, which you're probably familiar with, Celestial Seasonings, probably one of the biggest tea companies in the natural channel in the US. We're tiny compared to that, but even Wish Garden, we are going through over 40,000 pounds of herbs a year, and that's growing, if that makes sense. If we were in person, I would pause here and say any questions, any thoughts, but let's keep moving. Hopefully, I have shown you where this could go, sort of lit a little bit of a aha, and why we would be talking about them here under the panels. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing the next slide, Wish Garden, along with the project that a nonprofit that I'm putting together that I dreamed about in the early 90s when I was the first value-added booth at the Boulder Farmers Market. Let's bring herbs. Let's see what that can do and where that can go. And we've been partnering with Byron at Jack's Solar for about not quite 2 years now. I would say we started in our first plantings in the late summer of 2021. I think, Byron, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And we're just starting our second full season. And so some of these plants you're seeing that come from that. And I think I'll go to this slide and then maybe back up a second. So here you can see on the left what those beds look like, the 3 beds as Greg described. And we actually have 6 beds, 3 with irrigation and 3 without. And here's what it looks like before it's been planted. And oh my goodness, look at it on the right. This is with raspberries growing under there. Look how lush and happy those plants are. We don't yet have the kind of research and testing that Greg's doing, but we're going to start doing some of that this season. Christopher, who's part of CALC, is kind of making that happen, and looking forward to see what we get from that. And I'll speak more about that in a little bit. But let me comment about raspberry. Like most people would think about raspberry as being for the berries, and it definitely is. And that would be a crop, so to speak, that would be suitable for community food, farm to table types of things. But what you may not realize is raspberry leaf is a strong herb of commerce itself, raspberry leaf tea. And so there you have the potential for getting 2 crops after 1 plant that's not an annual, if that makes sense. And you might also notice how it has filled in those beds, which provides some weed control. One of the challenges, of course, is to do and raise productive revenue-producing crops cost effectively. And one of the challenges there is weeds. I'm going to back up here just a hair. Some of these plants you might be a little familiar with. Lavender. A lot of people love that, both on community herbalism, national, in the channel. $24. Of course, these are averages in general. It might vary. $24 for a pound of dry. And productivity, 40 pounds per 1/8 of acre. What does that compute to? Garden sage, culinary sage, herbs that most people only know culinarily, $15 a pound. But you know what? It's also a great herb of commerce. I'm going to use that language. Hopefully that carries with you. You can sell it into the natural channel for medicinal herbs. And it has a lot to offer. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to let you know, you just have a couple minutes left.
Okay. Motherwort, big, loves here, grows. Echinacea, 125 pounds per 1/8 of an acre. And that's just the root that you're using. Yarrow. So here are some examples of herbs that are currently growing there at Jack's that are commercially viable and productive. Let's see what we got. Both the previous presenters were talking about how the sun moves, and Jack's Solar Garden, those arrays move from east to west, and we're watching adaptability. What's going on? Where are these plant families? What about the mint family? What about the Apiaceae family? How do they do? Where do they want to be? If we have plants from out east, where are they going to be most happy? If we have plants from the Southwest or from the Mediterranean, where are they going to be most happy? Will they adapt? What's the adaptability? And with the image on the right, the lovage, kind of drew those little orange things to see from what Greg was talking about before. The one on the far right is getting full late day Western sun. Now, this is a plant from Europe and it mostly known for growing out east from a more temperate humid climate. It's not so happy there with full sun. It does like the midday sun. That's probably the tallest. And then over there on the left, you kind of see the scale and the bulk that's coming from the different amounts of sun and when in the day they're getting. Let's keep moving. Here with the clary sage, big, bulky, flowery, that's mostly known as an essential oil plant. But it's also viable as dried leaves. And okay, it's big, bulky, that's going to be weed inhibiting, it's happy. Over here on the right, this is just from this spring. You can see the plant that's resprouting, the bigger one. But what you can't see, and I don't know if you can see my arrows or not, but here are all the little seeds, the self seeds that have sprouted that will grow up and fill it out like it was in this other one.
I'm so looking forward to that too, Catherine, and then they'll be able to shade out all of our Canadian thistle. But I'm sorry to say we've run out of time for you there.
Okay. So let's talk about dry land. That's the last thing, and we can we're doing adaptability studies on a different array with water-wise strategies with swales. All right.
Thanks, Catherine. Much appreciated. And I think I requested for you to be able to start your video again. If you can look for that button after you stop sharing screen there.
Oh yeah, let's see.
But
yeah, okay,
there we are. Now folks can see it. But if you don't mind stopping sharing screen, so then everybody can see who we have here. I wanted to thank our presenters for taking the time to talk with us about the different types of crops we can grow within a solar array and what's looking good and maybe what's not looking as good. I wanted to start off with asking a few questions, then we can get to some of the Q&A that's going on. And Catherine, Greg, Mark, if you all have any questions for each other, be open to that too. But I wanted to start off with if you all could talk about your thoughts on how different plant families might be impacted by different solar array setups. And you can expound on that and take the questions where you go. Go ahead, Greg.
I'll start. And then our horticulturalists can jump in, and I would say that this kind of question is how we're hoping to drive agrivoltaics forward more quickly, because it's best to try to think about these different groups or plant families. So like each season at Jack's, we try to make sure we're doing like one or up to 4 varieties of each. So leafy greens versus tubers, things that are planted in the ground. They have an above ground portion, but you don't eat it. Tomatoes and peppers, where you having a big plant is great, but it doesn't necessarily, as we showed, mean that you have more or less of the actual fruits. I would say the biggest obvious winner, that if you're considering agrivoltaics and you like leafy greens, to go with leafy greens for a few reasons. Not only did you see the beautiful plants that Catherine was showing at Jack's, but plants, even if those leafy greens need more sunlight, what they're actually doing is stretching out to make a bigger leaf per plant, which, if you're harvesting those leaves as the horticultural crop, means higher production per plant. And in fact, we've learned from our partners, Sprout City Farms, working at Jack's, that they're trying to produce all of their leafy greens at Jack's. for some other reasons we can get into also if it's interesting. But that seemed to be a clear winner. Potatoes are more of a mixed story. I showed a big winner here. We had less of a winner in a russet potato. So it comes back to what Catherine was saying with thinking about our climate and our location, matching the right varieties for that, and then running with it.
And you mentioned celery and your dislike of celery, Greg. I love it. I happen to love it. And seems like it does pretty well from your studies as well. It's a really great question. Plant families are a good place to start and kind of think through. I like the categories that Greg mentioned, though, in terms of leafy greens versus fruiting crops versus maybe herbs. But even that is a pretty broad group. But when I think of grasses, for example, you could be talking about a forage, smooth brome as a grass, but you could also talk about sweet corn or field corn, dent corn. And those would probably perform differently, even though they're in a similar, the same plant family, one used for forage, one used for human consumption, and one used for maybe animal feed. So it does come case by case, but that doesn't mean, as Greg kind of alluded to, that we have to wait till the end of the growing season and test every of the 1,000 plus combinations. There's enough information available about what a crop's light needs are and maybe some spacing considerations. And then modeling, I mentioned that earlier, very early in my presentation. We can now do enough modeling with computer simulation to simulate the crop environment that would be produced, the microenvironment that would be produced, and then overlay that with the crops that we know would perform okay under those conditions or perform even better under those conditions.
I think the talk on celery was interesting because Catherine Lovage, as you pointed out, did quite well, and I believe they're in the same same family there.
That's true.
Good point.
Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Catherine, on plant families in the herb sector?
Yeah, I think that it is quite relevant. I just saw a question in the QA that I might throw out. Not exactly plant family, but the pollinators, like what do these various plants do? And medicinals, a lot of them, like the clary sage and many others, are also great pollinators. So they kind of go hand in hand. And even within a plant family, where is it native? Where did it come from? Mints are really interesting to look at from that point of view, because some of them come from Scotland, Ireland, over to the East Coast and what have you. And then others come from the Mediterranean. And it's interesting to watch how they respond to the different microclimates under the panels.
Thanks. Next question for you all. Have you noticed any difference in taste or smell or potency of the crops that you've worked with? And yeah. What would you say, Catherine?
Yes, where they're positioned and how much sun they get will often impact their taste. Just sort of simplistically, if they have aromatics in them, that's part of their taste. The ones that are on, let's see, what was Greg calling it, the seabed, or the bed that's on the east that's getting the west sun, plants put out more EOs. That's part of how they protect themselves with the aromatics. And when they're stressed under more sun, they're going to put out more of theirs, and they're going to taste a lot stronger.
Interesting.
That is interesting because focusing on plants that aren't necessarily intentionally producing those aromatics, like basil, for instance, we were seeing, some of those plants having larger leaves, and we wondered if they would actually be diffusing some of their flavors out. And so we ran some taste tests and found that, we weren't using professional taste testers. We're using people like on this webinar, just normal eating kind of people. And so we did it under controlled conditions and found no detectable difference, which we actually took as a win, in that people couldn't detect any kind of loss of flavor because you're diffusing it out. The other part that's interesting from a horticultural kind of crop perspective is that, just like you mentioned, putting out those volatile compounds to protect themselves, under stress, a lot of plants will then be attacked by pests. And so we saw a lot less pest attacks, which means one thing is all that sugar that plants are making from photosynthesis is not going into defensive compounds, which means there's more sugar for the plants to literally have a sweeter taste. But you also don't taste those plant defensive compounds, which are intentionally not tasty. And so we could taste the differences in the lettuce, for example. And it also, in terms of taste, affected the seasonality. This one was really a great showstopper up at Colorado, is we were seeing that the lettuce was just producing longer in the agrivoltaics. But, it's one thing to have a green leaf that lasts longer. It's another to see how well it tastes. And so we went and ate some of the lettuce in the control garden, which was limping along, trying to keep going, and it did not taste great. Whereas the lettuce in the agrivoltaics, which was not stressed and not doing all those stressy things, still tasted so buttery. So it was interesting to see how that taste thing also was related to how much longer the growing season maintained.
I'll throw down, thinking about that picture that Catherine showed of lemon balm. We have lemon balm plants growing underneath our solar panels and just a few feet away growing just outside the solar panels. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the season, when we were harvesting lemon balm, the lemon balm outside of the solar array had browned, and it didn't have a good smell to it anymore. It wasn't something we were interested in trying to sell. Whereas just a couple of feet away where the lemon balm was underneath the protection of the solar panels over the course of the day, it was vibrant. It was huge. We took it to an apothecary after we harvested and dried it to sell it, and they wanted more because it was some of the best that they'd ever had. So it was an interesting comparison just between just a few feet away from each other.
So Byron, I'd like to pose a question to our panelists.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we've had multiple people in the chat asking about things like forage crops or more, traditional row crops like corn, wheat, field beans. And this webinar was more specifically on, what we termed high value, so medicinal herbs, horticultural crops, etc. And I was just hoping one or a couple of you could maybe go over some of the key differences between, the management and the markets for these types of crops. And kind of how that would influence their place in fitting into agrivoltaics.
I would say I've talked plenty, and Mark is a horticulturalist in the state, so maybe you have input there.
Yeah. Sure. So the question was, yes, our focus today was the higher value per unit, getting more value out of that horticultural production. So that's why I kind of put my focus there. But one of the other questions that we addressed was, well, if I add up alfalfa and wheat in Colorado, the annual farm revenue is about almost $1 billion. So that's really important. And so we've just this year started a wheat project and an alfalfa project to evaluate yield impacts under those conditions. One thing I didn't mention explicitly today is that when you shift to those more agronomic type of crops, that would be typically larger scale, you may need to set it up kind of on the left-hand side of that infographic that I showed, where maybe the panels are vertical and are fixed. So vertical photovoltaics that might be 30 feet apart from each other, so large equipment could come through, may be the most compatible combination of photovoltaics and agronomic crops.
Thanks, Mark. Catherine?
I do have a side comment here. From what he was just saying, and that's not my world, is sort of field cropping with those kinds of crops. I mean, the one thing comes up to me is equipment and actually treating that like you would in the same way as a field crop. But what that would be challenging, a tractor and getting the scale that you would need to do that as hay or what have you. But I will throw out red clover, alfalfa, even oats, milky oats, mid-season when the seeds, those are very viable medicinal herb crops, probably at significantly more per pound than they would be as hay or grain.
Yeah, and I would also add that maybe you should have another webinar from CALC highlighting the work from the ecosystem service pollinator habitat plot that's happening there. It's one of the good things about JAX if you're not going to tout it yourself, and people measuring how different forage grasses are performing under these. But as Chris and Byron said, we were asked to stay focused on the higher value crops today, but there are trade-offs. There's thankfully a project looking across Colorado, Illinois, and Arizona, so different climate spaces, to look at agrivoltaics. And as Mark was saying, one way is just to space the panels out more to allow that equipment to come through. And those are projects that will be happening in the coming years, for sure. Those are all funded projects, working with Sandbox Solar, who was mentioned by Mark as a Colorado solar developer who will install these projects down here in Arizona and Colorado, and then another company in Illinois. So we can study exactly this question.
Good.
And we will have future webinars in this series that will cover some of those forage and ecosystem services crops. So stay tuned.
Yeah, so glad you all mentioned the future webinars. So next month we're going to have a webinar about policy. We'll have some folks from the American Farmland Trust be able to join us, the Colorado Department of Agriculture as well. Who was the third?
The Nature Conservancy.
The Nature Conservancy being able to join us in to talk about policy in June. And then in July, we'll be talking about agrivoltaics in the urban environment.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for mentioning Jennifer. She will be one of our panelists for that one.
Before I pass it back to the panelists to ask each other any questions, just to mention before you sign off, as I'm starting to see some people do so, we do have some survey questions. Please answer those. This just helps us learn so that we can do a better job in the future of providing educational opportunities about agrivoltaics to our community. But panelists, do you have any questions for each other? Any discussion points that you'd like to bring up?
There's a theme that showed up in the questions that I wanted to maybe ask my co-panelists, which is how do we get agrivoltaics out to all communities, including underserved communities, perhaps indigenous communities? Where does this fit, and how do we make sure that if there are benefits to these systems, that it gets to everyone? We don't accidentally, we're intentional about it, and we don't accidentally miss anybody. Sorry, it's probably a hard question.
You know,
but others posed it, and I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to bring it up.
I might jump in here to mention the idea that, I mean, we have over 10,000 acres of solar arrays in Colorado already. That is land that is underutilized, and we have a lot of people that are in our state that are looking for land to be able to operate, to work on. There's a possibility of providing space to those that are new to our country, that may have had agricultural experience in other countries, farming, gardening, shepherding, that now live in apartments in cities, that have those skills that we need to grow the food for our society, that could take the opportunity of working within solar arrays, that is land that is neglected and underutilized, and bring in these talents to continue working that land. So I think agrivoltaics is a wonderful opportunity for finding communities that don't have current access to land and helping to provide that to them.
And to that point, a baby step in that direction is we have been working with Nature Conservancy on an array with a group of indigenous, and I can't quite think of the right adjective to work with, but just exactly to your point, to provide access and get them involved in that.
Yeah, Byron, we've talked about this A lot. Yeah, that's exactly the motivation for some of our work farther south, where I have more opportunities to intersect with those lands that do have plenty of open growing spaces. I see it, knowing what we do. And so I think you're spot on in terms of thinking about that as one way to enable access to land. And the other one is we keep running into is access to seed source and seed sovereignty, and whose seeds are some of these seeds of some of these indigenous crops that can handle the abundant sunlight that comes between those rows of panels, but could still benefit in terms of that land access. But another one that we're really starting to explore is, imagine those solar panels, trying to do too many things at once. The solar panel, and whenever it rains, directly under the solar panel where my hand is going to be relatively dry, but that water will run off into that inner canopy or inter-panel space, which is going to also facilitate keeping some of these crops productive under future climate scenarios. So I would add everything to everything that you said and say that making sure we make the seeds available to those same communities who are looking for access to land.
How about if you had your druthers on figuring out, I love that word, being able to figure out the solar array where you could grow whatever it is that inspires you. For Greg, it's not celery, but maybe it's chiltepin peppers. What type of solar array would you want to build to grow the types of crops and have the agricultural activities that you're most interested in?
I can go first because I've been thinking about this a ton. At Jack's Solar Garden, you saw pictures. We're talking about 6 feet off the ground between that pivot point of the two of the panels that turn. I would probably go 7 because I'm 6'3". And so it'd be nice to have a few more inches. But in a lot of places around the globe, not at Jack's, we're doing this work. We're actually going like the full Ramada, 8 feet plus, and then having an overstory of checkerboard patterns of solar, because that's for more community scale projects. That's not the utility scale, but I'm not a utility developer. And so that's what I would do because of the opportunity to work in the shade and produce all of these shade loving crops in our sunny environments. But I think I'll add that everything we've seen today, and we're starting to see from other places, especially in our Western kind of dryland environments, you can make do with anything, but that's just what I'd prefer.
It's nice to not have to make do if solar developers actually design and build a system that helps to facilitate people being able to use the land underneath thereafter. As in, please design solar arrays with agrivoltaics in mind at the onset versus as an afterthought.
Are you opening it for soapbox? Because I would say, yeah. In addition to thinking about the immediate financial costs of that extra still, we're really trying to enumerate all of those soft benefits that come with this, like extending the growing season for all your leafy greens and your lemon balm. What is that worth? It's really difficult for the economists to tell us how those price changes out of season. What does it mean when you could go to the farmer's market or to distributors and say, I know tomato season is over, but it's not for us. Would you like them for another 4 weeks? What does it mean when you can actually get a solar project developed in a space where you need renewable energy because you've elevated them for agrivoltaics, as opposed to have that project shut down because of community opposition? So I think there are a lot more numbers that go into this as opposed to what we have been characterizing. So I would say at least keep an open mind towards developing intentionally for agrivoltaics.
Thanks for that, Greg. We're winding down here, friends. I want to thank Greg, Mark, Catherine. Thank you very much for taking the time to share your thoughts on agrivoltaics with this community. For those that have signed on and are still with us, please do feel free to share information with Christopher and I via email afterwards to tell us your thoughts about how this webinar went. and what future types of webinars you'd be interested in hearing about. We're here to try to serve our Colorado community, to help educate, inform, and provide more outreach to different communities across our state to learn about the potential of agrivoltaics. With that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar, and thank you all very much for joining in today. Have a good one.
Bye now.